I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to counsellingskillsacademy.com.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm well, thank you for asking, Rory. I'm very grateful to be here. Rory and I are grateful you've joined us. It's the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We're at episode 230, and we've got 3 topics for discussion today, starting off with our Counselling Foundations, where we're going to be speaking about existential therapy. Difficult to say for me, that existential therapy. I have to say it really slowly to get the words out. Then we're going on to focus on self, where we recognize you are the heartbeat of your practice. And today we're going to be speaking about adapting your therapeutic model. Is there a need? What does that mean? More coming your way in that section. And then we're going to end today with our practice matters, where today, Rory, you met up with a very, very special guest, Dr Pia Callesen, speaking about metacognitive therapy. So that's definitely something you want to be sticking around for. But let's lay the foundations that underpin good counselling practice, and speak about the theory of existential therapy. Everyone's giggling at my pronunciation, Rory.
Yes, and I think that's a great way to start. Your kind of stumbling to some extent of the word is indeed an existential crisis.
Yep.
of not knowing the meaning, and I think that leads us in nicely to what existentialism is. Existentialism is it's not really a philosophy. It's like a train of thought. Is that, we live and we die, and in between those two distinct points in time, we have to make decisions in our life to find meaning. And in fact, this was really kicked off by someone who, we will all know if we've studied person-centered therapy, and that's Søren Kierkegaard. Mm. Søren Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher, and he struggled a lot with existence. He had a number of siblings, all who died young, and he was afraid of dying because in those days, you could die very easily. He didn't have the medicines that we have now. And he wrote a book which has to, the title of which has to be the most accurate title of any book I've ever seen, and it's called Fear and Trembling, Ken.
I like it.
The book was called
I can
Fear
relate
and
on
Trembling.
many levels.
Yeah. And it was about the fear of existence. And I guess that's the roots, the base of existential therapy. And as Rollo May, as Irving Yalom very famously observed in 1980, there's 4 givens in the human condition: death, meaning, isolation, and freedom. And an existential therapist would try to help the client identify the meaning of their lives through their own goals, if you like, what it means to exist. And an example of that might be someone going through an existential crisis, say an athlete who finds themselves not being able to compete at the same level and having to retire. They would go through an existential crisis. What does the world hold for me now? What do I do? What meaning do I put in my life after all this work? And an existential therapist would help you with that.
It's an interesting thought train, as you kind of called it there, Rory, existentialism. And it kind of, it roots itself in the fact that I guess we all get to a point in our life where we go, hold on a second, I'm going to die someday. And that in itself is existential thought, the fact that we're looking at our life and going, there's an end to this life as we know it. And I guess with that comes a great responsibility. And the responsibility is, this is our life. We make decisions within our life. And we are responsible for the decisions that we make and sometimes the outcomes that those decisions will bring. I think there's great comfort in sitting and thinking that we are bobbing around in the ocean of life, and we are subject to the waves that hit us this way and that way, and that we don't really have a say, and it's not really me. But existentialism says it is you, and you're going to die one day, and you've got this life, and you need to live it, and you need to make the decisions, and you need to explore who you are, learn who you are, and take responsibility for the decisions that you make.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope we're not getting people too down with the opening part of this podcast.
Yeah.
So about death, anxiety, why am I here? What I would say is that there's a really, really good book written by Erich Fromm, who was a psychotherapist, and he wrote a book called Escape from Freedom. And I read it a few years ago, and I think it really summed the human condition up. He said that, we've only, and I talk about the Western world, there are still some places in the world where people are held as slaves. And indeed, in the Western world, we see slavery still. But when we're allowed to do what we want, we fear the freedom that brings. And that creates an anxiety. So as we have more freedom, and you do hear it, where shall I go on holiday? What shall I do? What shall I do in my spare time? And sometimes we struggle to work with the freedom we have, and that is about goals and decision making. And I'd recommend it a read to it's a good read for anybody who wants to try and understand the more existential parts of our existence. The fact that we have choices and we can do things, not for everybody, I accept that. But for those who can, sometimes the limiting factor is our own view of the world. And there's a great song by U2 called Get Out of Your Own Way.
Oh.
And I often play it when I'm thinking about, I can't do this and I can't do that. And it reminds me that, life's possibilities are endless. You are in charge of your own life. And I think an existential therapist will guide you to that and help you look for the meaning in your life. We're meaning searching creatures, Ken.
It's interesting you kind of led into that, speaking about maybe the depressive side of speaking about death and anxiety, which is all part of the existential way of thinking, of looking at stuff. And the thought is that with our lives having an end point, a death point, it gives meaning to the life that you live. This is the moment that you get to live. So although it can, I guess, just speaking about the topic, feel like it has a depressive side to it, it isn't. It's actually quite an optimistic side if you really delve down deeper into the thought pattern. And I think there's a lot to it, and there's a lot to get your head around when you're speaking about existentialism. And it's going to be about you and how you see it and what you make of it. So it is very individualistic, I guess, in so many ways. Rory's created an incredibly super duper handout. I've been reading over it this morning. It's really nice. It gives lots of food for thought, and I want to share a few things. So key lessons from this therapy. Nothing is fixed. All is movement. That's the very first part of the handout there. And I was thinking about that. If you look to Buddhism, that's one of the key principles of Buddhism, is that the only thing that is constant is change. We try to hang on to how it is now. Oh, it's nice now, so I want to hang on to this. Or it's not nice now, I want to get past this and go to a different place. We're always kind of either wanting to cling on or wanting to move past something. And the thought that nothing is fixed, that all is in movement, I think has got a comforting side to it at some point. We are constantly discovering and making sense of our lives. That's point 2 there. And how true is that? I mean, as therapists, we're encouraged to do personal development, and personal development is making sense of our lives. So I think that a lot of it would match in, and there's loads of stuff here. One of them that is jumping out to me here, and maybe this again keys into the depressive side, but does it, or is it true? And it is ultimately, we are alone and separate. It's interesting, isn't it? Are we? Or does our friendships and our relationships with others matter? And this is the thing about existentialism. It's really interesting, and there's lots to read about. Anxiety is hard to escape, whether existential, based on honesty with self about human life, or neurotic, based on fear of losing control. I could spend a week just on that sentence, Rory.
Yeah, you can understand why Sartre and and de Beauvoir and all the other existential, I say philosophers. It's not really a philosophy. Could spend hours sat in cafes on the banks of the French River, talking about this, and drinking coffee, because it's such a deep. It's very, very deep, isn't it? It's asked the fundamental question. Why are you here? What's your purpose in life? Why do you exist? And they're not easy questions to answer. And you may have different answers, if you find an answer indeed, at different parts of your life. And, I don't know about you, Ken, but if you think about maybe relationships or jobs that you were in, and you think, I could never leave this. This is as good as it gets. And then maybe through circumstances, the choice isn't yours. You have to go. And then you look back a few years later and you say, why did I stay there? Why did I stay there? The fear of doing something was actually inhibiting, the fact that that there's no more than this. And once one takes control of that and says, I will take a risk, I will try something, you are living really an existential life, because you're living with the anxiety and the fear of the decisions you make. But within that, you've taken control of your own life.
I like that. Just looking at how does this key into a therapeutic process? And there's three main parts to the therapeutic process when working existentially, and that is clarify the client's assumptions about the world. So this is the frame of reference that they might hold if we go to a person-centered way of describing that. Then examine the source and authority of the client's current value systems. Now that's interesting, because that to me kind of has a bit of a ring of behaviorism to it, to the ABC model there. And then encourage the client to take this new awareness and put it into action. Like you were saying, Rory, it's kind of, I guess there is a slight overlapping to the coaching system there, where you would aim towards something and then help the client to reach that point. Examine what's going on for you now. Examine the validity of that. Where did it come from? Where did you get that information? Where did you form that belief or that truth, as you call it, in your life? And then if that changes, well, first of all, the encouragement to kind of challenge that. And then when you do reach that new awareness, that aha moment, how are you going to put that into action, and how's it going to make a difference in your life? So there's kind of a very simplistic ABC of the therapeutic process.
Yeah, and I'll share with you a little kind of pastiche of my life. Many years ago, as a younger man, I always wanted to learn to dive into a swimming pool, but I could, even though I paid for lessons, I could never crack it. And it was a source of a bit of angst, really, because I'm a reasonable swimmer. And but the diving, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't throw myself in. And I remember stood at the deep end of the swimming pool one day thinking I'll have another go. And this little girl, she'd be about 8 or 10, kind of went next to me, and she looked at me. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to dive in." I said, "But I'm not sure how to do it." And she looked at me and she said, "Well, you do it like this," and dived in. And I thought, fair enough, I'll do it like that. And I hurtled myself into the water. It wasn't the most elegant of dives, but I'd let go of her. She'd helped me in her innocence, let go of her feet. You just do it like this. It's not that big a deal, really. You just do it like this.
Yeah.
And once I'd done it, I mean, people up at swimming pool must have thought it was odd. I just kept getting out and diving in again. I must have been there for an hour, just getting out and diving in.
Oh, I like that.
And I know. And it was just really bizarre. And sitting in the car on the way home, I pondered about why it was an 8 or 10-year-old girl that gave me the confidence to dive in, and what was it that was holding me back. And I think it was just the fact that being with someone who was saying, well, it's okay, just do this, and in a way that was kind of therapeutic, because that's what a therapist does. They set the ground to be able to say to people, well, why not?
Yep.
Why not? That's the existential elements of it. Why not?
I like the realness of what you've shared there, Rory. The congruence of it, I guess. So if we link that back to the model we just spoke about, the 3 points there, clarified the client's assumption about the world. Rory standing there going, this diving is a scary venture. Yes. I feel a little bit of fear here. I don't really want to do this. I don't know how to do this, but I do want to do it. I want to have accomplished it, but there is something standing in the way. Examine the source and authority of the client's current value system. Little 8-year-old girl comes along, says, what you doing? You do it like this, and jumps off. It kind of really puts into perspective. Hold on a second. Let me examine my belief over here. And then the 3rd point, encourage the client to take this new awareness and put it into action. Rory jumping off the diving board, getting out the pool, going back up the diving board, jumping off the diving board, getting out the pool, going back up the diving board. There it is. You've now had a lesson on existential therapy with a live example. There you have it. I think it's an interesting topic. This is definitely a handout you want to get. If you want to get Rory's super duper handout on existential therapy, where do you go? Well, you go to counsellingtutor.com. That's our website. That's where we hang out. Counsellingtutor.com. Go to the very top menu bar, click on the podcasts tab, and find today's podcast. That's episode 230. Right there on the page, you can download super duper handout. See, I'm starting to put a sound effect with that, Rory. Dun, dun, dun.
Super duper handout.
Too much coffee this morning before recording the podcast. But go and get it. Counsellingtutor.com, podcast tab, episode 230. Go and get that super duper handout on existential therapy. There it is, Rory. That's our foundations for this morning. Moving now onto that focus on self, where we're looking at adapting your therapeutic model.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And it's a really interesting question, this. And it is a question that comes up in my supervision practice, but it also comes up in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door, and our wonderful, caring moderation team will let you in. And you can join thousands and thousands of other like-minded people talking about counselling and psychotherapy. We have tutors, we have students, we have qualified colleagues, we have supervisors. The conversation just goes on, and the threads are really, really interesting. And one of the things that comes up a lot is people saying, I've been trained in one model of therapy, but actually my clients might need something else. And I think that's the key thing here. My clients need something else. And I don't know about yourself, Ken, as a supervisor, but some of my supervisees really kind of struggle sometimes with coming to me and saying, I've used this, but I'm a person-centered therapist, but I've used this, and I say to them, well, if you're skiing off piste, as I like to call it in my practice, skiing off piste, going off the kind of beaten trail, if you like, the safe trail. I said, that's fine as long as you know what you're doing, you're trained in it. And more to the point, you can evaluate it. How does it work? And, one of the things that we know through the years has changed is the fact that clients who present with trauma need a more trauma-informed therapist. They need to understand, how trauma affects the brain, how it might impact on the body over the years. And, a lot of people, in fact, I'm in the process now of making a course in trauma-informed practice. A lot of people a lot of therapists adapt their practice to include trauma-informed ideas. And, I think it's a good thing. And I'm all for people adapting their therapeutic models. Meeting the client where they are is important. We shouldn't be dogmatic about our practice. The client wants something, and a lot of clients ask for it. We should adapt our practices to it, and I guess that speaks a little bit to pluralistic therapy, doesn't it? Adapting our practices for our clients.
Indeed. And I think this goes with a bit of a caveat as we have this discussion. And as Rory and I always say, this is not advice or guidance that we're giving here.
No,
we are two colleagues. We're having a chat about certain conversations. We're not experts. We're not leading the way. We start these conversations so you can have them yourself with your peers and make decisions that are best fit for you. The caveat is, if you're a student and you are on a modality-specific training course. So I'm going to use an example. You're a student, you're doing a person-centered counseling qualification, you're in placement, then you should be working in a purely person-centered way. You're going to be supervised in a person-centered way, and you're working towards outcomes and evidencing that you have done what you've learned on your training. You're going to be writing about that in your assignments. So we're now talking about when you're qualified, when you're re-examining your what you know in your base modality and the peripheries that may come along that would be of benefit to your clients. And I think that there is a line. So we don't want to be working outside of our competence. So I, as a person-centered therapist with a minimum understanding of cognitive behavioral therapy, I would not be delivering cognitive behavioral therapy because I read the book, the ABCs of cognitive behavioral therapy for my clients, because I don't have the qualification, I don't have the training in it. But certainly we are required to do CPD. And when we do CPD, we're going to be gaining information that sits maybe outside of our core modality. And it is from that CPD that we can take elements. So we've done the training, we're getting the information from the correct source, that we can start integrating it and building it into our practice. And I think it's part of the maturing of any practice. I think anybody, if you look at when you first graduated and how you were in practice, and then how you might be 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, you're going to be a different person within that relationship. Well, maybe not a different person, but the way you practice is going to be different to when you first started.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think that, taking CPD in anything, even if you're a student, is a good thing, because it widens your knowledge, it widens your understanding of what a client might experience. And I think that any CPD may inform the way you work with a client within the container of your modality, and I think that's important. But I do think adapting your model, I guess if I look at the way I practice now to when I was a student, it would be vastly different. Yeah. But I'm still predominantly a person-centered therapist. It's such a, I won't say elastic, but it's such a wide bandwidth of person-centeredness. So, other person-centered therapists, they practice person-centered therapy in a different way to me. Mm. And I guess in a way, Rogers said that, didn't he? Rogers said it would be as different as each practitioner.
I love that. And it does leave a little bit of scope there. And I remember my very first supervisor correcting me when I said I work from the person-centered modality. And she challenged me on that. And she says, is it a modality or is it an approach? She didn't give me an answer. She just gave me something to go and think about. And where I sit with it now, it's an approach. Person-centered is a way of being, as Carl Rogers speaks about it. And yes, it is underpinned with some theory, which would make it swing towards being a model. But it's a way of being and a way of approaching something. So let's say, for instance, I had some information on trauma or the brain, Rory, and a client was presenting with something. Well, it is not 100%, not traditionally person-centered to start educating the client about something. That's not what we learn in person-centered. Yeah. However, what you can do is approach it in a person-centered way, where you might say to the client, I have some information that I've learned through my studies about trauma and how the brain works. Would that be interesting? Would that be helpful if I shared that with you? If the client says, yes, please, then it's being client-led, not us leading it. So you're taking a person-centered approach and bringing in another layer. Why? Because it's in benefit of the client. And as you've said, Rory, how ethical is it really if we know something that may be helpful to the client, but we hold it back?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember in my training many, many years ago, one of my peers, I can still see her now, sat by the window, looking really distressed. And I went over and talked to her. We were doing some skills work, and I chose her as a partner. And she was talking about infertility, and she was saying that the client had come and said that they'd been told they can't have any more infertility treatment for a specific reason. And my peer's daughter had gone through the same process, and exactly the same thing was happening. I can't remember the detail, but they were told that there was a different path. And she said, should I tell the client there's a different path? And I remember, and she was absolutely, she was called Pat. So if you're listening, Pat, I remember this very fondly. And I remember my tutor coming and standing and listening, observing our skills practice. And she said, why wouldn't you share information that could empower the client? And it was like, she was very good, Ellie, at dropping kind of truth bombs. And it was like, boom, okay.
Yeah.
That pushes us forward a bit. And she went away and she did share that information, and it was accurate information, and the client was able to access the services that the client needed. And it was a big talking point. Would you do it? Should you do it? Some people took it to the supervisor. Supervisor said no. Others said, I think it's a good idea. And it basically boils down to where you sit within that. But it's interesting. One maybe to discuss, I think, in supervision or with your peers, because it happens more than we think, I think, more than we know.
Supervision.
Yeah.
Take it to supervision and there you have a peer that is working with you in service of your clients to look over it, and you get another opinion and view on that. But, Rory, we say this so often, this is your practice. Now it doesn't matter what organization you work with or whether you're in private practice or working within an agency. It doesn't matter. It's still you there at that front line. It is your practice, and how you choose to develop and grow your practice 100% up to you. It really, really is. Of course, we need to be ethical. And you said all the right things there, Rory. Checked it with the supervisor, checked that the client was able to access the service. We don't want to and check that the information was accurate. We don't share stuff unless we really know it, unless we've done the CPD. We don't share our thoughts and our opinions to expand our therapeutic model. We expand within our learning, within our competences, and we're doing it always in service of the clients that come to see us.
Yeah, and it's interesting. That was 20 years ago, that story. And it's stuck with me through the years, because in that short interaction, Pat, my peer, still remember her now, she assuaged so much pain. Yeah. She took away pain. She helped the client, move on. And I often, if I have a looking out of the window moment, I often wonder, if my peer still remembers it, and I often wonder what happened to her client, how that worked out, and it just ripples through lives, doesn't it? And I think sometimes adapting the therapeutic model, being more informed about things, and maybe sometimes taking a risk with ethics, boundaries, and consulting supervision could sometimes make a real difference to a life. So I think it's a real talking point, Ken.
It is, Rory, and you kind of mention the impact that messaging had on you if you have something that can aid or help your client, then why wouldn't you share it with them? That came from your tutor.
Yeah.
You shared that same way of thinking in my training when I was training under you.
Yes.
How many students learned that from you that came from your tutor? And then my question is, how many clients' lives have been positively affected from that one lesson shared by your tutor to you, to the people that you teach, and then passed on to clients? And that's what this is all about at the end of the day. And that's why we have these conversations.
Absolutely, Ken. And, I think we started off the top of the podcast with, existential ideas. And I think this really strongly links to existential. It's about meaning. It's about, how am I in my practice? What does it mean? And I think all these are incredibly strong pointers in personal development. Really are.
There it is. That's the focus on self, and we reverse out of that now into our practice matters, where we touch on an element of practice. It can be from running a practice to what we might see presenting in practice. And today, a very special guest on the podcast. It is Dr. Pia Callesen speaking to you, Rory, about metacognitive therapy.
You know, Ken, it's not often that you have two very special things happen in an interview. One is you talk about someone who's, in the process of developing a new meta model of therapy. And also one of the people who are developing that meta model of therapy live in your hometown of Manchester. So I caught up with Dr. Pia Callesen to explore what is metacognitive therapy. And this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
The National Counselling Society is proud to sponsor Practice Matters. National Counselling Society are really excited to have launched their Children and Young People Therapist Register for counsellors working with the younger age group. To find out more, visit nationalcounselingsociety.org. nationalcounselingsociety.org.
And I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Pia Callesen, who's a metacognitive therapist. So, Dr. Callesen, thank you so much for joining us in this interview.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, you talk about metacognitive therapy. What is metacognitive therapy?
Well, it's actually a new paradigm in psychology. Its history is way back, actually. It was Professor Adrian Wells who he actually did a lot of research in what are the main causes of psychological illnesses. So he spent at least 30 years investigating, is it, inherent? Is it the level of self-esteem? What's the main factors? And in this research, he found out that the main factor that distinguishes people who get depressed and anxious and people who don't, it's the time they spend on their thoughts. That is the main factor. So basically, if you spend 10 hours a day ruminating and worrying and thought suppressing, then you become worse than if you spend half an hour a day. And that is actually a new paradigm in psychology, because in traditional psychology like CBT, which I did for the first 10 years, we spend time on thoughts, and we actually ask people to spend more time as homework. So I would ask my clients as a CBT therapist to go home and spend time, investigating their thoughts and changing their thoughts and interpretations and so on. But if it's too much time on thoughts, we can't really change depression and anxiety by spending more time. So in metacognitive therapy, we actually have the goal to spend less time on thoughts and feelings and teach our clients to spend less time, so that the thoughts can actually self-regulate. So it's based on this self-regulation theory that you, of course, have thoughts and feelings throughout life. You get sad, you get happy, and so on. But if you leave those thoughts and feelings alone, they will self-regulate. So you don't obviously leave them alone if you ruminate 10 hours a day. Then you will maintain your condition. And you can actually maintain it to a chronic depression level if you ruminate a lot. If you do it for hours and months, then you will end up being chronically depressed. Yeah.
So sometimes we refer to overthinking when people say I'm overthinking this. Exactly. And the paralysis of analysis, where people get paralyzed by yes. So you would encourage people to not ruminate on their thoughts and feelings. So how would you direct them away from that? Where would you direct them to?
People think that the opposite of rumination is an empty head, and that's not the case. So the opposite of worrying and ruminating and overthinking is not an empty head, but a head where you have thoughts, but you leave the thoughts alone. And we use some metaphors for this so that people can understand it better. We use the fish hook metaphor, so that you like a fish in the water, and you can't really control if there's a lot of fish hooks or if there's a few ones. But the best strategy is not to chew too much on these fish hooks, because then you will get worse. So that's like a metaphor for it. Or the telephone metaphor. Your thoughts are ringing you. What you're going to do with your situation. Your trigger thoughts are ringing you. Oh my God, what am I going to do? Am I going to get better? What about the future? But you don't need to answer the telephone. You don't need to answer your thoughts. So these the telephone metaphor, the fishhook metaphor, these are metaphors for what you need to do in your head. So you instruct yourself to leave your thoughts alone. Don't answer them, let them ring. You don't need to, push them out of your head. You don't need to silence them. You can still leave them alone, even if they're noisy.
But you don't.
So that's sorry?
Yeah, but you don't engage with them. You don't spend time. You don't engage with them.
Exactly. So you don't. You leave the thoughts ringing, and like with the telephone, eventually they will get sick of ringing you. So the trigger thoughts will eventually stop ringing, and so. Like the telephone metaphor, and so they will self-regulate, as you say. So the reason why people spend too much time thinking is that there are some metacognitive beliefs that keep this overthinking going. And the main metacognitive belief we spend time on, in metacognitive therapy, is the uncontrollability belief. So if you ask people, why do you spend 10 hours a day worrying and ruminating, they will say, I can't stop it. It's not something I can control. It's uncontrollable. So we actually work with restructuring this metacognitive belief and make people realize that they have this kind of control. They have a choice. They can actually leave those thoughts and feelings alone if they want to. So we challenge this uncontrollability belief. And another belief that can also maintain this overthinking is the usefulness belief. So people think, I need to think for 10 hours because then I can solve my problems. So it's like a positive metacognitive beliefs. If I ruminate, I solve my problems. If I worry, I'm more prepared. So these are the beliefs we also change, so that you realize, well, I can spend half an hour that's equally effective than 10 hours a day worrying.
Yes. So if you do decide to answer the phone, you can answer it for a few minutes, not spend all day on the worry phone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm fascinated with this. So is this a taught model? So would the therapist kind of teach these techniques to the client?
Yeah. Well, there are some programs. There's the masterclass actually directed by Professor Adrian Wells and Professor Hans Nordahl from Trondheim University. So Professor Adrian Wells from Manchester is actually the originator of metacognitive therapy, and they are doing a certification class 2-year program. I think it's both online, and you can get it in UK, in Manchester, and of course in Copenhagen.
Yes.
He's coming to Copenhagen too. So if you're a therapist, you can actually enroll in this program, and I'm a supervisor there, so you can maybe get supervision from me. I'm not sure, but yes. So so that's the options, because and then you will learn it the proper way, of course.
Of course.
So psychological methods are unregulated, at least in Denmark, and that's a problem, because anyone can teach anyone a method they're not even trained in themselves. So it's completely unregulated.
Yes.
I'm not sure it's the same in UK, is it?
It is pretty much the same in the UK. On the podcast I've referred to counselling in the UK as a bit of the Wild West, where people can do anything from a master's degree course right down to a weekend online training course and call themselves counsellors. Yeah.
So that's also not good.
How many sessions would it take typically for somebody to be able to master, for a client to be able to master this technique and not answer the phone?
Well, usually it's about 5 to 12 sessions. The manuals are 12 sessions, 10 to 12 sessions.
Yeah.
And so it's a short-term manualized treatment, and it's very research based. So when you look at the research, it's about 70 to 90% who actually completely recover from their diagnosis. In my research, it was 74% who got completely out of the depression diagnosis, independent of level of depression. So it was the chronic depressed, the severely depressed, 74%, which is probably the highest recorded recovery rate ever. So it's really, really good effect size. And it's 90% for generalized anxiety. And it's about those 80% with OCD and PTSD. And it's a very gentle method, because normally in CBT, at least, we do a lot of exposure treatments, like you have to do the things you're scared of, and you have to talk about your trauma again and again and again. But in metacognitive therapy, it's not based on exposure. It's based on this self-regulation theory. So we don't spend time exposing people to their feared thoughts and emotions. We spend time teaching them that they're able to leave those thoughts and trauma thoughts, flashbacks alone. It's a very gentle treatment in that sense.
How interesting, yeah. And it's diametrically opposed to some therapists that actually take you back to the trauma time and try and get you to view it through a different prism. Maybe seems to me that it's to use the metaphor of not answering the phone, you get people to ignore them more than engage with them.
Yeah, exactly. But ignoring is not pushing them away, because people misunderstand metacognitive therapy that you need to push thoughts away, you need to suppress your emotions, but that's not really the case. You still have emotions, you still have your trigger thoughts, but you don't engage and you don't push them either. So it's actually a more lazy approach where you leave them alone.
It's quite interesting you speak like this, because many years ago I was a support worker and I used to work with people who had a lot of diagnoses, one being schizophrenia, voice hearing. And one of the techniques that I was taught by a psychiatrist was just to get them to ignore the voices. And to get them to squabble between themselves sometimes, just let them squabble between themselves, talk.
I'm not sure if that's doing something if you're trying to control your thoughts or you're trying to control your voices. In the metacognitive solution is that you leave the voices alone, so you don't try to make them do certain things.
No.
You don't want to control the voices.
Yes.
But they can do whatever they want, but maybe that's what you
just leave them alone. And you say that training for this can be done online, either in Manchester, which is where I'm actually based at the moment, which is interesting. Yes, or in Copenhagen. And is it
or in other places in other countries as well, in Italy and in Norway and Germany and so on.
Yeah. And you say it's a new paradigm. How recognised is it within the kind of therapeutic world?
Well, it's of course hasn't got as much research than CBT yet, because of it's not that old. It's not an old paradigm. But if you look into the research, there's been a couple of meta-analysis where it's looking very promising and probably better than CBT. And at some point, the NICE guidelines need to look into this. And the Danish health authorities, you can't ignore research long.
No.
Of course, there's a whole bunch of people doing CBT and other approaches who will, of course, not be. But you can't ignore the fact that you can actually cure 80% with this approach. You can get many more people out of their misery with this very gentle, very short-term approach. And research is so promising that at some point you have to accept. The NICE guidelines have to recommend this as a first treatment for at least anxiety and depression with the current evidence.
That is remarkable, isn't it? We do hear, a paradigm, for those who wonder what a paradigm is, I had to look it up, was that it's an overall agreement of something. So gravity is a paradigm. We all agree there and thereabouts on gravity. And to develop a completely new therapy, and to have such startling, is the word I'd use, results, is pretty incredible, isn't it? Really, it is.
But it's completely turning the whole approach, because I was doing CBT for 10 years. So it's the main part is actually, all the things you've learned, you have to kind of do it in a completely different way. Because when I did CBT, I would go into content, I would challenge people's thoughts and, what they're thinking and so on. And you have to ignore this in metacognitive therapy. The main part is asking, how much time do you spend? What do you spend time on? Can you leave your thoughts alone? So it's a completely different dialogue and a different focus as a therapist. You need to develop these skills, and it takes time.
Well, I think on that note, it's been a fascinating insight into a growing edge of practice and psychological theory. And with such glowing initial findings, I think we're probably going to hear a lot more about metacognitive therapy. So on that note, Dr. Pia Callesen, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you to Dr. Pia Callesen. Thank you to you, Rory, for hosting that interview, bringing that information to us. And this has been the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 230.
Yes, we started off with existential therapy and the concern of existence, and then we moved on to focus on self, adapting your therapeutic model, developing what you know and how you engage with that knowledge within your practice. And then finally, an interview with Dr. Pia Callesen, an emerging meta model of therapy called Metacognitive Therapy. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.